So today is day number 2 of our 3-day workshop. On Tuesday, we talked about the general theme of institutional gender analysis and getting ready, talking about the context. And then we also did some exercises on developing indicators. Today, we're going to talk more about data and presenting the data and methodologies for calculating the indicators. And we're also going to give you a very small piece of homework to do. Don't worry, it's not going to be too difficult or too time consuming, but hopefully it will help consolidate the learning outcomes from today's session. So the first question I have for you, and if you can put it in the chat, is why is it important to have a proper data management system when it comes to gender institutional analysis? To monitor progress, to track change, to improve measures to achieve gender equity, to understand the status quo, to perform intersectional analysis, to ensure data protection, to understand the reality of gender equality, to have a better look at the entire data. Yeah, absolutely. All these things are very important. To have a proper way to measure disequalities, make sure our actions reflect the status of the organization, to have access to data. Indeed. And so a data management system allows you to track all this in a way that is systematic. And that's what we'll be talking about this morning. Compare data between states. Yeah, I think comparing data between states is a bit tricky when we're talking at the institutional level, but it's useful to have standardized sets of indicators because then you can compare those across different institutions. And if institutions across Europe, for example, use a standard set of indicators, then you can indeed measure the differences between states. Okay, so a data management system is key to our goal of institutional gender analysis and implementation of a gender equality plan. That is the main fundamental reason. And you can only measure that change if you conduct audits and assessments and monitor progress through the data and indicators that you collect. And so the key aspects of a data management system relies on a few different things. The first is structures for collecting the data and collating it in one place, for storing it for future analysis and comparisons, and for analyzing the data with secure and legally adequate methods to enable the correct insights. And I'll be talking a lot about this aspect because privacy is very important in the context of data analysis. And so building that trust in how the data is used is really important. And so we have to be very mindful of how confidential data and sensitive data is used, not only for legal reasons, but in order to build that trust and make sure that people have confidence in how it is going to be used for the purposes of analysis. So storing and saving that historic data is important, collecting it in the first place. You might need to collaborate with others in order to obtain it. So you need to be concerned about secure transmission. You might need to disseminate it or distribute summaries to other people or produce briefings and reports so that they can understand better the situation. I mentioned this earlier, analyzing the process, analyzing or processing the data in a secure way. It's very, very important. And really for me, the key aspect of all of this is to understand where are our gaps so that we can do something about it. So there are a few things that I would do when I think about undertaking a data exercise. The first is think about the indicators and the data sources and the scope of the gender analysis. And what I mean by scope is, are you limited in specific themes or areas that you're going to be doing? Ideally, you want to do a comprehensive, full analysis covering every single aspect, but that may not be realistic. So you might be focused solely on, for example, gender pay gap and career progression in the first instance as a pilot phase. And then later on, you might be doing more work in different areas. The second step that I think is creating a data management plan. And if you undertake research, then you'll be familiar with this. And then the third step is very simple, just implementing that data management plan. So for that collection of data and information in the first place, there's really three main steps. The first is identifying those data requirements. The second is identify the data sources and providers, and that will lead you to find out what the gaps are, and will lead you to think about who do you need to discuss it with in order to fill those gaps, and what do you need to do in order to obtain that information, for example, by conducting a survey, because it's information that isn't currently being collected. And the third step is saving that data and information on an ongoing basis so that you can track that change. And so for most people, that's maybe a monthly data input that they get from a particular department, or perhaps quarterly, or maybe you're just doing an annual census. And we're going to look at that in more detail. So those data needs and requirements that you start with are really going to be focused on a number of different themes. The first is to understand the difference between the qualitative and quantitative data needs that you have. And we talked about the need for a mixture of indicators in order to get a whole picture of the situation in your institution. And so understanding what those data inputs are in order to calculate your indicators is the first step. That's going to lead you to identify gaps. And that's really important because then you can take steps to fill those gaps. And then ideally, you want disaggregated data, but you might not have that in the first instance. You might identify that what you have is data that is purely totals, aggregated data that doesn't give you information about gender. And what you want to do is implement steps and processes in order to, going forward, have the data collected in such a way where you can disaggregate it. Another point about the data needs exercise is to focus on what information are you going to use from all the data that's available in your organization. So having an element of selection is really important, because you might be given a lot of information from different stakeholders, but not all of it might be relevant, and not all of it might be of a good enough quality that it can be used for this type of exercise. Similarly, you might have very large data sets, and you might need to extract the data from those data sets in order to focus in on the information that you need. And we mentioned the participatory approaches that are really required in order to determine what those data needs are. So a co-created approach is really important through consultation. I wanted to give you an example of what data needs analysis might look like. So here is a table that I've created, and I've picked an indicator. I've said staff gender ratio. And so my data requirement is the number of staff. And the details that I need are number of employees on the first day of the month. And I want this information by staff category. I want it disaggregated by gender. And I also want it by department and faculty. I said it must also include contract status, fixed term, permanent, and part-time. And I also want disability status, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age for this analysis. So in my notes, I've said that an HR officer sends a report by email every month, and they're going to give me the information in these staff categories, but only age and disability is available from them. So of all the things that I've asked for an intersectional approach, they're only able to give me limited information. Another example, gender pay gap. I said I want the median monthly earnings, and I want that information by staff category. disaggregated by gender, and again, by department and faculty. And I also wanted that stratified by the contract type, whether they were fixed term, permanent, or part-time. And this is a summary report that was sent by the payroll section every quarter, so not every month. And so this is the type of exercise that you can do in order to identify your data needs and also have a systematic way of capturing where the data is coming from, what the source is, how you're going to use it. So when we talk about processing data and information, this is a really important part of the exercise. Thinking about what format the data is received in, what further analysis or processing is going to take place, and the privacy concerns. And I think that I want to spend some time talking about privacy concerns in more detail. So let's take an example. The number of complaints received by the university regarding sexual harassment in 2020. And so if you imagine this is a made-up data set, you have department down one side, you have males, females, non-binary, and this is the number of complaints received regarding sexual harassment. Is this a good way of presenting information? Why or why not? I think that it's very important that if this information is going to stakeholders within the institution, particularly in the departments, it might not be a very privacy mindful way of presenting the information, because the information can lead people to know who is actually affected by this. So I would say that this is possibly a problematic way of presenting the information. The sample numbers are very low. It might be a bit better to present the information as a total, but again, this doesn't give you a full picture. Another possible way of presenting the same information is doing it as a proportion without giving numbers. So if you do it in a chart like this, you can see which departments have the biggest problem in terms of totals, but it isn't going to give information about who the person who was affected might be. So it's really important to think about where the information is going. Of course, it may be appropriate that this type of information is provided to very senior leadership in an institution on a tight and confidential basis so that they understand what are the numbers, but it might not be appropriate lower down where the people are close to those who are making the complaint. So it really depends on the audience. So that kind of privacy aspect is really important, and it is actually a legal requirement of GDPR under Article 35, and it applies when processing sensitive data or data of a highly personal nature. And so how you report that information really needs to be considered very properly. And where you have very low sample numbers, 10 or less, you really need to take care, because you could inadvertently and unexpectedly reveal someone's identity. So even though that's not your intention, it could happen by accident. So I would really urge you to think about this and to get advice within your organization in order to make sure that you're complying with this aspect. And then the final aspect that I wanted to talk about is about storage of data. There's a lot of information that can be collected, and having the right kind of documentation as part of your data management plan is really important, because it will give you the ability to go back to it and understand how you used it. Storing the data and filing it in a way that is properly labeled will give you a much easier time down the line, especially if you're doing this on a multi-year basis, in order to have that information readily available for future analysis. keeping that information in a digital format nowadays is common. So understanding who has access to that is really key. And then that aspect of security is really important, because you might have access to sensitive information, for example, information about salaries that you might need to keep very, very strictly controlled and make sure that only a limited number of individuals have access to this. So we're going to talk about methodologies for developing and analyzing indicators. And I'd like to start off by talking about quantitative data and indicators. But before I begin, I just want to make it clear, this is not a research methods course. So I'm only going to cover at a very high level the most common indicators, both quantitative and qualitative, because there are so many methodologies and we don't have all day. Some of them are not very common in gender analysis, like ethnographic methods where you observe, but they might be used in certain circumstances. So I'm just going to cover the common ones. So when we talk about quantitative data and indicators, we're usually referring to numerical information. And we're really thinking about the numbers of things. And over the last session and today, you've heard Anna and I mention that often just looking at the number isn't really the most helpful, because in many circumstances, you want to know the percentage or proportion, but sometimes it is helpful to know about the number of things, particularly if it is about the number of people who have responsibilities for welfare or equal opportunities or diversity and inclusion, things like that. The proportion is often the more useful one. And then quite often we talk about averages, but you will know that there is the mean, median, and mode. And there's other definitions of averages as well. And it's really important to understand and remember the differences between these, because often when we talk about average, we mean the arithmetic average, where you add all the numbers and then divide it by the number of entries, and that's your mean. The problem with the mean is that you can skew the data if you have very large and very small numbers. So quite often the median is a more appropriate measure. If these are new terms for you, please do look them up or ask questions, but I think most of you will be very familiar with this. When it comes to numerical information, I always advise to try and present it graphically in a bar chart, a line graph, a pie chart, something that you can look at and easily tell what it is. Oh, I think Anna's raised her hand. Yes, Anna? You're muted.
Thank you. Yes, one comment that is very related to what you just say, Karim. So I don't leave it until the end. So it makes sense right now. Related to the median and the mean. As you say, we can skew depending on the size of the sample and so. And another thing to pay a lot of attention to is when you calculate gender pay gap, use both. So do a calculation with the mean, do a calculation with the median, because if there are two, for example, two very, very high salaries, two women, let's assume, with very high salaries, they will bring your mean, so your average, they will bring it up, so to speak, even if most of the sample of the female salaries are quite low. So if you have 40 women working for €1,000 a month, and then you happen to have two or one with 10,000 a month or 20,000 a month, then you will have a mean that it's not a good description of what's going on. And in that case, the median might be a better option. So just consider how dispersed your sample is, and always try to calculate both to better understand what's going on in the case, for example, of gender pay gap or bonus pay gap. Karim, does this make sense? Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, and I was about to discuss that next. So you've already covered it, which is great.
Sorry,
thanks, Anna.
my apologies.
That's quite all right. Basically, when you're talking about quantitative data, do you really need to use more sophisticated statistical analysis? Maybe you might want to do an independent samples t-test to establish if there's a statistically significant difference. I have to say, I've only seen this happen once in all the analysis that I've read. Mostly it's just reported as the median earnings, and then you can do, you can really see a percentage difference. And if you're doing complicated calculations like the gender pay gap, you need to use a validated method. And there are guidance documents available from reputable organizations that give you the step-by-step process and what you need to do, because there are the gender pay gap is just not one number. It's really multi-layered, as Anna mentioned. So I won't talk about that more since Anna covered it. So we'll move on to the qualitative information. Qualitative data and indicators. For most of this, you can use surveys and questionnaires, but I'd like to talk about some of the issues. One is being aware of the sample size, and I'll give you an example for this. If you have a very small sample, let's say only 12 people from your entire organization of 2,000 people responded to your survey, it is not going to be very representative. You might have biased questions. A biased question is one that really doesn't leave very much room for the person to answer in an alternative. So you might just say, do you agree that we should have departmental coordinators for equal opportunities? And you might have yes or no. It might be better to have a Likert scale where you give people the options out of 5. They might not know, they might agree, disagree, strongly disagree, etc. Frequency of surveys and questionnaires can really be a problem, because if you do them too often, people don't like to fill them in. And so it's really important to remember that you can't overload people with too many of these. And then if they are anonymous, is there a way for you to follow up on some of the richer detail? Might you want to engage these people who have already answered your survey in further work? Interviews are great. They give you very rich insights, but with interviews, they do give you rich insights, but you have to choose an appropriate method to conduct them. And there's a lot of extra work that goes into transcribing them, to do the sentiment analysis, to look for frequent words. And also, how do you protect the anonymity of individuals that participate in your interviews? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in this next section, because you can use case studies and personas in order to bring the data alive. You're showing something really important by using a case study, and it allows you to draw attention to particular issues, but these need to be concise. With personas, not everybody likes to use them. If you don't know what a persona is, you can, I'll explain it briefly. Essentially, you're making up a profile of a person based on information that you've gathered from interviews and surveys. So you might interview a range of different individuals within your organization, and then you might come up with a persona where you're gathering all the intersectional perspectives from an early career researcher, an established researcher, and someone else who's in a leadership position, and all the kinds of issues that they've indicated from their surveys. And you create a profile where it's made up, but you're putting together a story that says, okay, Joan, made up person, has 3 children and works as a professor at the Department of Medicine, and you're writing a story basically, and it's creating a very rich detail of that person's perceptions and feelings with regards to, for example, their experience of working in a medical department within the institution, and the issues that they've encountered that have affected them that are related to gender discrimination, for example. So case studies, personas, very interesting approaches. Focus group discussions for exploring needs and attitudes are really good as well. But there are other methods too. This next section is just to continue talking about qualitative methodologies for assessing and evaluating indicators and data. So quite often, it was mentioned in our exercises today, the need to evaluate or analyze policies, to look at processes, to examine procedures. And that's really important in the context of a gender analysis to make sure it's detailed, to ascertain patterns, and to determine what the perceptions of your stakeholders are. So I mentioned stakeholders on Tuesday in terms of that analysis, but it's often really important to understand how does a policy actually affect people on the ground, because what's written may not necessarily be how others perceive it and how their experience of that policy in their particular department works. The other aspect of this is when you're doing training and capacity building initiatives, it's always really important to understand how that translates into practice change, the reality on the ground in your organization. And although we talk about policy analysis and evaluation, these are slightly different things. Quite often, their evaluation is part of analysis, but there is a distinction. Analysis is about trying to map out the need for the policy, who's going to be affected by it, and the justification, resources needed to implement it. Evaluation is more about how has that policy actually affected change and how has it worked. And when we look at policies, a good way of trying to establish that is a quality impact assessment. So for your quality impact assessment, it is basically trying to capture how this is going to have an impact on different groups of people. You start with the summary of the aims and objectives of your policy or of your event. So you can do a quality impact assessment on not just policy, but different types of activities. What involvement and consultation has been done in relation to the policy. That stakeholder analysis is really important for this. Who is affected? What are the arrangements for monitoring and reviewing the actual impact? And to do this, you need to use a set structure and methodological framework. There are so many different frameworks out there, published in the academic literature as well. Think tanks have published a lot of toolkits on how you can do this. And my suggestion to you is to always remember to define what impact means for you in your organization. And are you actually talking about outcomes or outputs? And to consult others when you're doing the quality impact assessment. It's not something you do by yourself in a room locked away. It's something that you involve others in.
Some other methodologies besides the ones that were very were mentioned and very thoroughly explained by Karim. Basically, I did this chart to show you a bit the entire picture of the methodology that we're going to discuss. This one in particular is the methodology of keyword-based query. This is our methodology. I will explain what that is about. So as you know, I come from an institutional change project towards gender equality, and we had our indicators developed. And one of those was the gender sensitive of courses at our university, gender sensitivity of research projects and thesis publications in the past 2 years. So we took a 2-year frame for these 3 indicators. These are 3 separated indicators. So gender sensitivity in courses, in research projects, and thesis of our students. The data that we used was basically the syllabi of all courses in the past 2 years, the abstract and title of all theses in the past 2 years. That was a typo. Abstract and title of all research projects in the past 2 years, and abstract and title of all publications in the past 2 years. And what are the sources of this data? I don't know if you're familiar with Scopus, but that's the biggest database, or yeah, most reliable database on publications. We had our academic departments in which whose doors we knocked to give us their syllabi of the courses. The theses were in the library database, so those are uploaded, easy to find. And the research projects are managed by our academic cooperation office, which is basically the unit that manages funding for research. So they have all the projects. So this quantitative methodology that we use, the keyword-based query for all of the indicators that I just showed you. And how did we do this? So how is this methodology, and what was it about when we put it together? So a course, a research project, a publication, or a thesis was considered to have a gender dimension whenever it included in its title, abstract, general descriptions, or readings, in this case, the syllabi, or their main general description, any of the 45 keywords. These are the 45 keywords. I'm going to go through them, although it's dense, but asexual, so you have an idea of the scope. Asexual, asexuality, bisexual, bisexuality, cisgender, drag, father, female, feminine, femininity, feminism, feminist, gay, gender, gendered, heteronormativity, heterosexual, heterosexuality, homonormativity, homophobia, homophobic, homosexual, homosexuality, homosociality, intersex, LGBTQ, male, masculine, masculinity, men, when it's not considered as a marker of gender sensitivity, it's used as a synonym of humankind, misogyny, misogyny, mother, motherhood, MSM, paternity, patriarchal, patriarchy, queer, queering, queerness, same-sex couples, same-sex partnerships, sex and marriage, sexism, transgender women. So those are the 45 keywords. If in all of this material that I just told you, one of these keywords appeared, we decided this has a gender dimension. So this research project course thesis has a gender dimension. How did it come up with this methodology? We basically used she figures. I think it's biannual 3 years. So every 3 years publication by the European Commission on the status of gender equality in research and innovation in Europe. They are using this method. And basically, I myself, who is not a gender studies scholar, but a gender studies scholar, I went through 5 years of MA and PhD thesis and selected the keywords by hand. And we also received input from students and other gender experts to build this list. So we basically rely on the expertise of me and other experts in our university, gender experts in our university, we have a lot of them, to put together this list of 45 keywords. I found this extremely exciting. And the other methodology, which is a quantitative and qualitative, so a hybrid methodology that Karim already mentioned that this is possible. It was text/content analysis and statistical methods for the indicator gender sensitivity of internal and external communications of the CEU of our university in the last 2 months. And our data was the promo brochures of all academic departments, all official Facebook posts, all official Twitter posts, all official Instagram posts, and all official website. So in our official website, all the news section that I forgot to mention there. And this might come in the way of text, video, or picture. And we had 2 focuses here. The content that is depicted, not only in text, but also the gender of the people depicted and the gender of the author of that piece of news or that post or whatever. And what was this methodology about? We analyzed all types of materials that I said, pictures, text, or video on 2 axes. The presence of women in active roles and the appearance of gender, 2, the appearance of gender-related topics. And the third is representation of racial, ethnic diversity, body diversity. This is non-conforming body shape, gender non-conforming people like trans, non-binary people, age diversity, and disabled bodies. So you can see here that it was a very intersectional approach. We did not only focus on gender, but also many other variables as well. So a communication, regarding the first indicator, a communication material was considered to present women in active roles if women represented 50% of or more of the people featured in the picture, text or video. Same logic applied to male in the second, so active participation of men, and active participation of diversity in any way. Non-human images and text, of course, were not counted in this methodology, because you cannot do anything about non-human content. And we even analyzed this in 2 layers. The layer 1 represents the material that is accessible at first sight, major visibility, so the front page of our website, for example. And the second layer referring to the material that is accessed after 1 click or a hyperlink, which gives less visibility. So you can see it's a very, very complex analysis. And the communication material was considered to present a gender-related topic whenever it included any of the 45 keywords that I told you before. And for the gender of the author of that piece of news or of that post, we basically used head count. That was pretty much it.